I will try and answer maybe some of these questions, but I don't think I'm going to manage to answer all of them. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. I'd like to start by thanking particularly Robert Hillenbrand for his paper this morning, because in that masterly way he has of using English, he conjured up in a way that I could never hope some of the things I'm going to touch on as well. In fact, I'm going to start with a quotation that I scribbled down quickly, which is, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about the symbolism of light in pottery, and therefore I am going to be mired in the merely prosaic. And indeed, clay is one of the most prosaic materials, and particularly when we think of it in terms of light. It is, this is more how we should see it, an opaque material, transformed by fire indeed, but it returns to being stubbornly earthen in its material. It's not for nothing that we call pieces like this earthenware. So I'm going to start looking at pottery, as it were, from the outside in, from the surface inwards, to see what connections we can make with light and the way light is used. Now, I suspect I might have been invited because the people thought I was going to talk about luster. Well, I'm afraid I'm not, for a number of reasons. Firstly, I've spent a lot of time talking about luster, and I'm not sure I've got much more to say. Matt Sabar recently published a very brilliant, interesting article on the reception and appreciation of luster, of why it resonated with Abbasid aesthetics, and I don't think I need to say more about that. There's an additional practical problem that, again, Robert touched on, which is that luster is very difficult to photograph. As he said, still photographs do not convey anything of the quality of a good luster piece. This is a bowl, 20-centimetre bowl in the Iran Bastan Museum. It is the most splendid bit of Kashan lusterware that I know. An extraordinary, rich, resplendent colour, full of metallic reflections and mother-of-pearl highlights. And when you photograph it, it looks brown. And you see a little bit of gold maybe where the highlight is. And this is true of so many luster pieces. And it seems to me pointless trying to talk to you about a visual effect if I can't illustrate it visually. So I'm not going to talk about luster. Robert also touched on the issue of what those splendid schemes of grand luster tiling in the 13th and 14th century might have looked like originally. And that is a very interesting question. It has a number of problems, though, for us. The first being that those shrines where the tiles are still in situ are inaccessible to scholars. So the shrine at Mashhad has never been photographed properly until Ghoochani's book comes out, unless it has come out. We have no real scholarly analysis of it. There is also the case in this one that recent modern lighting systems, restoration, redecoration, have certainly transformed this space into something very, very different from its medieval origins. The second problem is that those shrines where scholars do have access, well, so have other less scrupulous people in earlier times. So here at Natanz, which had a splendid set of tiles, indeed Robert showed one of them, which is now in the Victorian Albert Museum, and they've all gone. As far as I know, this small fragment of a luster tile in that bottom right-hand corner is the only surviving piece in the shrine. So that's not going to help us very much either. So, no, I'm not going to talk about luster. Luster is the most superficial ceramic decoration. I mean that literally, that it sits on the surface of a glaze, it penetrates the metallic particles that make it up, penetrate maybe a few microns into the top surface, but it is very much on the top. So going a bit further into a pot, what we see and think of in terms of light. Well, one thing is the white surface. We are very used now to white surfaces in all the pottery we see, but it is actually quite a novelty. Even the Chinese didn't do it for some, get it really right for many centuries when they started producing high-fired wares. But as far in the Islamic world, from the 9th century, Chinese white porcelains arrive. And the local potters wanted to copy that white surface. The Chinese porcelain is a white-bodied material with a thin, transparent glaze. But the local copy relied on producing an opaque white glaze over the clay body. And that became the basis. Here on the right is just a straight, plain copy of the Chinese piece. I showed the bottom because all ceramic experts, you don't look at the top of a pot, you look at the bottom. It's much more informative. And it shows you this broad foot is a particularly Chinese element, so being copied there in Iraq. And it provides the basis for the decoration of a whole swathe of wares that develop in the 9th century. So painting in blue, the luster painting, painting in green. And as one of the continual things is we soon forget about the rather wonderful nature of producing this white surface and concentrate on the pattern making. But that white surface is only skin deep. It hides a coloured clay body underneath. So in this slide up here, which is a cross-section, a broken sherd of pot, pottery specialists actually like their pots broken. They're much more informative when you can see the cross-sections. You have the opaque white glaze, top and bottom, covering a yellowish clay in the middle. And this technology spread very quickly, one of the great phenomenons of the early period. So by the 10th century, such wares were being made everywhere from Spain in the west to Central Asia, Samarkand in Central Asia in the east. And in all the cases, the opaque white glaze is covering a coloured clay body. So a yellowish body here in Egypt, a reddish body in Samarkand. And in the east as well, they developed another white-surfaced pottery, earthenwares, which were done in a slightly different technology and owe nothing to China at all. The inspiration for these wares, what they are, if I'm allowed to use that word, skeuomorphs for, is silverware. And the white surface of the pot and the black decoration, which is a clay slip decoration applied, copying the polished silver and yellow decoration of silverware. So a cheap way of getting, referencing the more expensive material. Though I have to say these earthenware pieces shown on the left here are some of the very best ceramics ever made in the Islamic world. They're extraordinary pieces of quality and control over fairly simple materials, as well as, of course, the beautiful calligraphy. But again, we're dealing with something that is only skin deep. Here, this is the transparent glaze. Sorry, my slides, these are not proper professionally done cross-sections polished and mounted in the way they should be. They're rather rough things. That is a transparent glaze there. It looks greenish. Underneath, this is the layer of white clay that gives you the impression of a white dish, but underneath, it's very much a red or yellow clay that is being covered up. So in the first centuries of Islamic rule, what we see is the development of white grounds for pottery. That was something new. And that this technology to make white grounds spread right across the Islamic world from east to west. Then, in the 11th century, there was a change. The porcelains introduced from China were of a different nature. They were much thinner, they were much finer, they had subtle carved decoration, which under the thin transparent glaze could give these very beautiful and almost hidden decorations. Now this could not be copied in the opaque white glaze on the yellow clayed body. So the Islamic potters resurrected an ancient Egyptian technique, confusingly known as Egyptian faience, but which is in fact a fritware. This is an artificially compounded ceramic body made largely of ground quartz with a bit of white clay to stick it together while you're working, and some glass mixture in the body, which then mixes with the clay during the firing and produces a glassy matrix to stick all the ground quartz together. And the advantage of this is that it produces a body, a fabric, a clay that is pure white. So now we can put a transparent glaze on and copy the same sort of incise decorations that the Chinese had been doing. And here we are, another one of my cross sections. The transparent glaze on the top, and you see the way it soaks into the top layer of the frit, and the fritware body, which is the ground quartz underneath, and white in a way that the earlier clays weren't. Now we can follow the exploitation of this material best in Iran. This is not because necessarily they were the first or the best to do it, but because in the history of collecting, the Iranian sites have been more carefully plundered to produce objects for museums. And pieces like this is in the Louvre, a wonderful plain fritware bowl with this arabesque carving on the outside, and just relying on the quality of that fritware body, also known to some people as stone paste, but I'm afraid I haven't adopted that terminology myself yet, to show what quality can be got from this. You will see that it's broken, stuck together, and a bit stained. Unlike the Chinese, it is not nearly as hard as the Chinese, it breaks more easily, and it is also porous, so that when it's buried it will suck in dirt and other things in a way that porcelain, which is a vitrified body, won't. But as earlier happened, we got over the plain white material quickly and invented a number of other decorative techniques, and we start looking only at the pattern painted and stop admiring the white ground. Underglaze painting, the most important development of this medieval period, because it produces the technology in which all fine ceramics are going to be made from this moment on. And indeed they are made not just with the underglaze painting, but with the fritware body. So that in something like these Iznik pieces from the 16th century, it's essentially the same technology being used as was used in Iran in the 12th century. And again, we are struck by, blinded by the wonderful painting patterns on these pots, and forget to look at the background. But in fact, it is the quality of the Iznik body, the extraordinarily fine, wonderful surface, colour and texture of them that lets the colours float and sing and gives Iznik pottery their special quality. And in my book, Iznik at its best is as good as any pottery ever made anywhere. So we now at least have a white fabric to deal with in the Islamic world, and this starts perhaps in the 11th century, late 11th century, and I believe starts in Egypt. Now, when you're cutting, incising a fine bowl of fritware, it's probably quite easy to slip with your little sharp tool and poke a hole in the vessel. That originally started off probably being a mistake, but they discovered that even if it got a hole through it, when you glazed the piece, the glaze would fill that hole and give you a little, what I've called here, a transparency, a little window. The transparent glaze fills it, the bowl is still waterproof, it doesn't leak out, but you have this pierced decoration. This piece, I say Egyptian or Syrian. We know about the Egyptian production, we know a lot about the Iranian production. The Egyptian production, surprisingly, we don't know so much about. This could be an Egyptian piece. And in case anyone's thinking, as in so many techniques, the Islamic world anticipated China by several centuries in the development of this, and the famous Chinese rice grain ware, which I show there, is a much later development in the Far East. But as before with fritware, it is in Iran that we can follow the extraordinary achievements of potters doing these transparencies. Now, these patterns are cut through the frit fabric before it is fired. The fritware is a friable, sandy material. It's very fragile in the unfired state, and yet they pierce patterns through of some complexity. They then cover it in a glaze, which is a liquid, before they put it in the kiln to fire it. That already is a risky procedure, the whole thing dissolving in a pile of mush. And of course, when you fire it, the glaze goes liquid again at a very high temperature and softens, the whole fabric softens again, risking that the whole piece will collapse. I stand in awe of some of these pieces of how they were actually done. So a very small cup on the left, a goblet about so high, drinking goblet on the right with a more elaborate arabesque band around the top. Here you see the effect of the light behind shining through the windows, the pot itself still being opaque. Pieces such as this from a bowl maybe 25 centimeters in diameter, a fragment in the Louvre again, this painted arabesque, and when you shine the light from behind, you see that all those arabesques are pierced through and filled with glaze. And more fragments I could show you, which are just astonishing when you imagine what skill, patience, delicacy it took to put these through the kiln to produce the pierced ware with these quite big transparencies in the end. It's not surprising, and I bet it was quite often, that they actually collapsed in the kiln just from overheating, softening, and folding in on themselves. Now, these pierced decoration, the transparencies, carry on. They're at their most complex here in what I call the pre-Mongol period, so the late 12th, the early 13th century. We find them again in the Mongol period, less elaborate. They then seems to disappear as a technique for a bit, but actually we don't know a lot about 15th and 16th century Iranian pottery. Then in the 17th century, it comes back again in the Safavid period. Not something that would have impressed the Kashan potter of the late 12th century in its complexity, but nevertheless little holes poked and filled with the glaze. But in the 18th century in Iran, they developed this technique again further. Not the kind of inscriptions and animal friezes that we'd seen before, but with simple geometric patterns, but do evolve quite complex decoration. I mean, I'm astonished that this piece sort of stayed together and didn't tear apart like, stamps coming apart while it was being made and fired. This is a distinct class of Safavid ware, a fine, hard fritware, harder than the normal run of Safavid wares. They're mostly dated to the 18th century, particularly because of a comment by an English writer in the late 17th century, where he talks about Gombrun ware. This is Gombrun ware, named after the port from which these wares were shipped in Iran. And he's comparing it to a French soft-paste porcelain. And the interesting thing from our point of view, and an interest in light, is that he's talking about translucency. He remarks, I think I remember rightly, that it was the Vincennes porcelain factory, that had produced a very translucent ware. And he compares it to Gombrun ware, which indeed is little else but total vitrification. And in this piece, this is not pierced decoration, simply incised, and with the light behind, you see the lighter areas. This pot is now translucent. Now, translucency, you will all know, has been a quality of Chinese porcelain in particular for a long period. In fact, from the 11th century, those fine carved pieces I showed you are very translucent. And translucency in Chinese porcelain was something that the Islamic world knew and admired greatly. So here's the quotation from the Akhbar al-Sin, middle of the 9th century, a fine clay through which you could see the gleam of water, though they are made of clay. So this is another example of the extraordinary skill of the Chinese in making wonderful artifacts. And then 2 centuries later, in the Book of Curious Information, and they have translucent porcelain vessels. So it becomes a sort of regular trope in writing. And it brings us to the traveller that Anna just mentioned, Nasiri Khusro, an Iranian who in 1047 first visited Cairo. And amidst his astonishment at the riches and splendor of what you could find in the bazaar in Cairo, of the extraordinary range of fruit, for instance, and other produce you could find, he singles out, as one of the things to mention, is this. They make types of porcelain, well, souffalier could be porcelain vessels, pottery vessels, which are so fine and translucent that you can see your hand behind it when held up in the light. So in the middle of the 11th century, he's saying there is translucent pottery made in Cairo. He goes on to say, they paint them to resemble Bukalamun, and we take that to mean they were decorated with luster, which is the the one decorative pigment that does change colour depending on the way that you hold it. Now this famous few lines, famous for people interested in pottery, have caused some problem and discussion over the years. Because the real question, did the Fatimids in Egypt make translucent pottery? And people have ranged up for and against this proposition. And you find it's the early scholars, particularly Martin and Fouquet around 1900, claim they have in their possession fragments of translucent Egyptian pottery that match Nassiri Khosrow's description. Unfortunately, against that, both before Théodore Dec, the great French technologist, and then a whole series of scholars right down to the present day, say, no, we know Islamic pottery is not translucent. Something is wrong here. So what are other explanations for his claim? Well, one is that he was looking at opaque white glass. Opaque white glass will be translucent. It was made, bowls of it, and was decorated with luster. So this is the base of a bowl in opaque white glass, decorated in 11th century style in luster from Fustat, from the finds, and in the Cairo Museum. So it is possible that this is what Nassiri Khosrow was looking at. It's possible that he was mixing two different experiences. In his excitement, he was taken to the shop, and he was shown quickly, one after the other, a Chinese imported white porcelain piece and a piece of luster, local pottery lustered. The porcelain would have been taken out and held up to the light for him to see that it was translucent, and then he remembered the luster as well and confused the two stories. That's a possibility too. There's actually an even weirder, no, that's not weird, that's quite straightforward. There's a weird possibility, and this is something I still find quite bizarre. There are fragments of Chinese white porcelain found at Fustat, decorated in luster. Now you might say, well, they imported the Chinese porcelain, and then the local luster people decorated a few in luster. The problem is the painting style looks nothing like any of the Fatimid luster pottery. This sort of wiry, spiky designs. But what's more, it looks like nothing ever done in China. It's not a Chinese style of painting. So we have a problem now. The latest report is that there are 70 sherds of this ware, of Chinese ware, decorated luster, have been found in Fustat. And we don't know what and where it's from and why. But it's possible that Nassiri Khosrow was looking at these. Here's the latest report from the Oriental Ceramic Society transactions, and still this funny, spiky style of painting that relates to nothing that we particularly know about. There's a slight possibility that what Nassiri Khosrow was looking at were opaque, Fatimid wares, but with pierced transparencies. And where the pierced transparencies are, the little windows, you could probably see that your hand was behind it, so to speak. They're very rare. I only know of these few fragments published a long time ago, said to be from Fustat, fritware with pierced transparencies. But the proposition I'd like to put to you is somewhat different. Now, I said before, the Egyptian ware, fine fritwares, survive fairly small quantities and mostly in small sherds. The fritware industry, however, in Syria and Iran is quite clearly migrant workshops from the Egyptian capital. Coming out and setting up, doing the same technology, the same shapes, the same decorative features and so forth. So you may think I'm cheating, but I'm going to use quite a lot of Iranian examples to argue my case for an Egyptian. We'll come on to that. This is an Iranian piece, late 12th century, a well-known mold type of which several examples are done. Pierced transparency decoration. But look, when you look at it backlit, ignore the bit over there, this is plastic restoration. But round here, where the fritware is very thin, it starts looking translucent. Even more so on this piece, a Persian bowl with a purple manganese glaze, quite heavy. Transparency is done, the wall has become very thin and is clearly translucent. So, if we go back to Egypt, they're making very fine fritwares with very thin walls, they're decorating them in luster. Is it possible these are translucent? Now, I'm going to pretend to do a bit of science now. I hope there aren't any real scientists in the room because I will be caught out tremendously. Fritware, you grind quartz pebbles and you mix it with the clay and glass and it's fired, which is why the quartz particles are angular. They're not just fine sand picked up and used. The black holes in this are air pockets. The white colour around the grey here is the glass made from the clay and the glaze material, which in the firing turns to a glassy matrix that sticks all the bits together. Now, the finer you make the pottery, the fewer air holes and other inclusions you will find. And it is particularly the air holes that will stop the light rays passing through. This is my photon arriving, or light beam, depending on which way we're measuring it. When it comes across a boundary of very different refractive indexes, it gets bent. So the beam of light will get dispersed, will be sent in all different kind of directions, and probably won't arrive at the other end. If it finds a path where it meets far fewer of those pockets, the light will get through. It won't be transparent, but it will be translucent. In other words, you'll get a glow of light on the far side. So to illustrate that with my fritware, glaze on the left, light ray coming through, hits a inclusion, light dispersed, it's opaque. Another path it finds, sails right through. Quartz, after all, is translucent or transparent indeed, and glass is a vitrified material likewise. Now, this is the piece that Martin claimed in 1899 and illustrated in 1929. He had in his possession, it's now in his collection in the Museum in Faenza. He claimed it was transparent, but I think that was just, he wasn't a native English speaker. He means translucent. And here it is on the bottom, and the piece I've been showing, the Fatimid fritware on the top. The walls of these pieces are around 2 millimeters thick. The glaze layer on each side, the glaze soaks in about 0.5 millimeter. So you only have 1 millimeter of the frit fabric in the middle of the wall. Interestingly, the piece that Martin claimed to be translucent, you notice, has got a slightly milky glaze, as though it's slightly opacified to help the whiteness. And fine fritwares with luster painting are known in some quantity from Fustart. So this fragment of a wall, the wall of a bowl here, again 2 millimeter thick body, slightly fatter one here on the right, with the word Saad, whether that's a name or not, still up for discussion. And here a whole selection of sherds from the Victoria and Albert Museum collection, all of these fritwares, transparent glazes, and painting in luster on the top, in, I have to say, a style which otherwise one would say is definitely 11th century. These are. This one may be a bit later. And a lot of these very thin walled too. So even though the frit itself is not the whitest we've ever seen, it's still a pretty thin material. So what do we do about this? Well, I'm English, so it's British empiricism to the fore. I do a little test, and my gratitude to the Ashmolean Museum, who allowed me to take a number of their bowls, put me in a little darkened room. I have a light source, which is one of the things you use for microscope work, a pair of fiber optic cables with a light, so I'm getting light here. My camera, I can turn the lights off, I can see what happens. And a photometer. I measured the intensity of light where it was hitting the pot. If you spread the two beams apart, as on the left there, around 4,000 lux. If you concentrated them, up to 20,000 lux. Sounds a lot. In some ways it is a lot, but lux are very funny things as far as I can see. that at up to 1 lux at night outside you can see and walk around. 130 lux for direct sunlight when it's very bright. But in my measurements, I'm dealing somewhere with light which is the equivalent of an overcast day, not direct sunlight. So around 4,000 to 20,000 lux. Interestingly, we mostly see these objects in museum conditions around, because of conservation issues, of around 250 lux. Or if we're lucky in a store, office lighting levels 500 lux. So very, very dim compared with outdoors. And of course, Nassiri Khusro, direct sunlight in Cairo, we're up in them. Even the Ashmolean foyer, this is England I'm talking about, in the foyer they measured not direct sunlight, but the sunlight in the main building was 40,000 lux. So bright sunlight, very strong. And I'm not dealing with bright light here. So I start with some Iranian pieces, standard things which we know, 12th century, fritwares, plain white, with relief decoration, carved or molded. And this is them in the full 250 or 500 office lux neon tubes. And then when I shine the lights through them, I get this. They are, in fact, fully translucent. The color, that yellowish, possibly that the fritware has a certain amount of iron in it that will give that color, or it may have been dirt they've absorbed during burial. The opaque parts on these, of course, this is plaster restoration, where nothing is coming through. But this area, the darker bits, where the wall is thicker, and the brighter bits where it's been carved away. And another experiment with another goblet, rather thicker wall material this time, carved decoration again, and when backlit, fully translucent. So those are 2 Iranian pieces. I next looked at Syrian bowls, Syrian, possibly even Egyptian, possibly a bit earlier in date, with carved and pierced transparency decoration in the band around the outside. And we can see here translucent when it is backlit. Very translucent when it is backlit. So translucent that when you put your hand in it, you can see it from the other side. I'm sorry, I should have got a model with thinner, nicer fingers, but... So here, finally, I suggest, is the most probable explanation of Nassiri Khusro's comment that he saw porcelain so fine and translucent that you could see your hand through it. Here, this is a plain white piece, but as I've shown before, similar pieces were decorated with luster. Now, in the interest of strict academic argument, I would have to say this is one of the possibilities. And of course, it is still possible that actually he had seen opaque white glass or this funny Chinese material. And I put that up because personally, I have a problem with my discovery. If we accept that fine fritware with luster decoration was seen by Nassiri Khusro in 1047, I have to shift my whole dating parameter of the development of fritware, its spread to Syria and into Iran and so forth, by about 50 years earlier. I'm still working on that. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver. It's absolutely wonderful to see someone, you know, they say, il faut mettre la main à la pâte, you know, I mean, so you have actually put your hand in the...
A lesson in going back to the object.
A lesson in going back to the object, yes. So what I would like to do now is invite all the speakers from today's sessions to come up to the front, where Sheila and I will join you on either side, and we'll have microphones.
With your wonderful visions we saw of the great mosque in Cordoba, That was very exciting. Thank you. I just wondered whether you considered, and this is only a question that probably could come from me, what the carpets looked like on the floor and how the light would have reflected them. I would suspected there would have been a flat woven carpet on the floor, and it would have been quite absorbed the light unless they were very light grounds. Probably like a Persian zilu or something of that period would have been something that would have been on the floor. I don't think any fragments remain, but I'm wondering if you considered that when you looked at the light reflection from the floor in Cordoba.
Thank you, Michael. In fact, this is where the minute that the first iteration was done, I went, oh my God, it's reflecting off the floor. So that is why we put in a matte surface. And so I was thinking more or less of a Zilu type, and frankly had not put in any color. And here's the problem. Every time you insert another twist, you have to push it through, the entire computer program. And, even though I managed to unveil, the School of Design and the School of Engineering, there's a limit to the number of iterations they allowed me to do. Still, in the final, let me put it this way. In the last iteration, the floor is somewhat textured and non-reflective. So to the extent that I was able to do that, I still recall the mats more than actual colored rugs. Thank you.
Okay. No. These were all wonderful papers, and I actually have a few different questions for each of you, but it's just one.
Limit to one per.
One question?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to perhaps ask a question of Dr. Watson. Do we know about how these bowls were used? Were they used as light fixtures?
I doubt very much they were used as light fixtures, but we don't know how they were used in particular. I mean, they look like eating and drinking bowls. I've no evidence for...
Would that have been possible?
Well, it's possible, but I have no evidence for...
So there's no textual descriptions of that at all? No, it's a shame. Thank you.
Do we have one down here? Yes, a question.
The question for Professor Graham. I was reading a book called The Vision of Islam by Chitik and Murata, and they make a distinction between created light and uncreated light. Created light, of course, referring to the Malaika or angels, and uncreated being God himself. I wondered if that puts or explains why the likeness of his light, which was a subject that you talked about, could refer to the believer or Muhammad or to Allah itself. Could that explain or could that suggest that where the likeness is directed to who the likeness is directed? Is it to God or is it to the believers or to Muhammad, as you said?
Get my mic on. That's very difficult to answer. I don't think I have a good answer to that. My guess is that this kind of distinction is relatively late. I did in one of the notes that I made to this paper, which I'm afraid the notes were about a third as long as the paper. I did look into some of the sort of really 10th century, basically 10th century, 4th, 10th century theological works. The Rafidites, in some cases, did hold that God, and I just was trying to, Paul, you were asking, I was just trying to put my hands on it, did hold God, for instance, one of them, Hisham bin Salim, who died, we're not quite sure, sometime in the late 900s, held God to be a shining light, a nur sati, And so there were some of the, I mean, they generally are held to be heretical, of course, in the end, were people who held that God was a shining light, which was equating God with light. But I have a feeling that later, talking about a distinction between the Malaika and their light and God's light is probably a later, maybe more a theosophical and philosophical development of later thought that is probably certainly post 4th century, I would think, post 10th century. I would guess, and it's just an area that I'm not expert in and really can't give you a good answer about. It's just, it's my ignorance. I don't know. Sorry, but it's a very good question.
Do we have a question down here from Ayala?
It's a comment regarding the lectures of Professor Hillenbrand and Renata Holodz. Actually, the traditions regarding to lightening public buildings, for instance, the Abdul Rahman tradition on the Haram Sharif from the end of the Umayyad periods, and Sabt ibn Jawzi, who described the lights during the month of Rajab, Sha'ban, and Ramadan, where they describe 5,000 lights, and then during the festivities they added 2,000 candles. So now in regard to that, within the excavations in Israel, there were found chains, metal chains, in a public building that was just recently identified as a mosque lamp. And beside that, there were also lampstands that were found within a few excavations. So all these, pictured together gives us quite a good picture of lightening during the early Islamic periods.
I think what's interesting here is your reference to Ramadan and the idea that at certain times of the year you use a different degree of illumination. And that's simply a matter of making more engines of illumination available, whether these are big candles, really big candles, or whether they're rows of lamps. It's quite interesting to look at the lamps that are currently available for study in Mamluk buildings in Cairo. Quite sparsely separated, but it takes nothing except a couple of workmen to shin up to the tie beams and quadruple, quintuple, sextuple the number of lamps, and suddenly you've got a totally different quality of illumination. And it's not limited to the interior. There's a chance reference by the poet Anvari in about 1185, where this is an unfortunate poet who fancied himself as an astrologer, and he predicted something no astrologer should ever do, that there would be a desperate earthquake in the middle of Jumada II. And everybody was waiting for it, and people went into the cellars. And on the night, there wasn't even enough of a breeze to put out the lamp that was on top of the minaret. So he disappeared in humiliation. We don't hear any more of him. That tells you that at some times the minaret itself was lit up, as indeed minarets throughout the Islamic world are lit up at the end of Ramadan to this day. So I thank you for that, because you're stressing that we're not talking about an absolutely even spread of light throughout the year.
Other questions, perhaps from the back? Anybody? It's slightly hard to see from where we are, so you have to raise your hand. Yes, Antonio Vallejo.
Good afternoon. Only to confirm the one of the Professor Hillenbrand, uh, about the rough tiles of Madinat al-Zara in Córdoba. The excavation have given many rough tiles of different, with luster of different colors, brown, white, and green, that so many buildings of the city have roofs with different colors.
Thank you. Other questions, other comments? Yes, down here in the front row again, back to the front.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Contadini about the rock crystal production. When did it stop in Egypt, and if we know the reasons it stopped?
It is usually said that this stops abruptly sometime in the 11th century. But I wouldn't look at it in that way. What it stops, it stopped the very highest quality of rock crystal, as you've seen, the ewers. That type of very highly sophisticated craftsmanship somehow doesn't continue. But the carving of rock crystal continues in Sicily. It continues also in glass, for example, the Edwick glasses. The crystals that are now, discussed whether they are European or Sicilian, and the scholars are not quite agreed on that. And obviously in Europe, with German carvers and the Burgundian later on in the 14th century. So the carving of crystal around the Mediterranean and beyond continues. And then it is somehow, you can see rock crystal carved at different degrees during the, in the Ottoman period and also in Iran later on. But it's that type of very highly sophisticated craftsman that is not continued. So yes, there is a continuation of carving rock crystal, but in a different way. We don't know why. Also, if you think about the rock crystal ewers, I mean, we only have very precise dates when they've got inscriptions that refer to precise caliphs or personages. But the consensus, I think, is that they were produced within a rather short period of time. So it may have come from particular workshops or more than one workshop that then sort of, died out with the advent of the Ayyubids, maybe. Yes, but I myself would like to think about it that rock crystal doesn't stop being carved, but it continues in a different way.
I was going to ask Elahe a question. That I was curious. All of us, of course, are probably worried about being forgotten in our own times. And so I wondered if you could expand a little bit more about why Ibn al-Haytham's text was lost and was so not well known and disseminated in the lands where it was written.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. One of the explanations is that the manuscripts, as we have them, are very few comparatively. I mean, even now we have about 6 of them, all incomplete, and they're all in one place now, Istanbul. That doesn't mean anything. Some of them were executed. One was in Basra and one possibly in Syria. So there is very little to really extract from that to know why it didn't go. I think the passage that I read from Farsi, which Professor Safarov first pointed to and translated, leads us in that direction. He talks about his teacher having seen it and so on, but we still have no idea where those places were. Now, chance plays a role, and I tried to explain that with Ptolemy's book, for example, had the same fate in some ways, even less so, because in the Islamic world, nobody had access to it properly, and Ibn Haytham was the only one who actually did use it, and that was an important text. But one of the things that I didn't get a chance to really sort of emphasize, this tradition of, let's say, the scientific tradition is very continuous tradition. They have their own authorities, and they have their own subjects where they deal with it. And so it has a very sort of narrow kind of direction for itself. And in the case of Ibn Haytham, it's unfortunate that this happened. Of course, Farsi became the person who commentated on all the 7 books and became the authority on that. And we really don't know whether the similarity of his work to what was done in Europe means there was an actual transmission or not. I'm one of those people who does not believe in saying, oh, it must have. We do not have the evidence. I mean, similarities are all over the place between optics and, you know, let's say art, but we can't really draw the line and say they did. But that's a rare history, which is why I sort of...
I will take chairman's prerogative or co-chairman's prerogative and say that that's exactly what we're trying to do in these conferences, is not just pass our wisdom from professor to student, but to broaden the access and the knowledge so that it won't be forgotten and it won't just end up going down a little narrow path, but will really be accessible to all. So we had some more questions down here.
Thank you. Today, while I was listening to all the talk, I mean, in particular, after Professor Hillenbrand and Professor Contadini speeches, and also Professor Watson's speech, I thought that thinking about material transparency and the use of glass and the use of crystal, I couldn't stop wondering about architecture built with those materials. And in particular, it came to my mind 2 examples. One is a crystal pavilion in one of the palaces in Marrakesh. And of course, it doesn't exist anymore, but we just have the foundations. And the other buildings that came to my mind is a very interesting building, and this one is known only through a Venetian traveler account. And it is a pavilion that used to be in the Topkapi Palace in the garden, and it was built completely out of glass. Also, the roof was made of glass, and there was water pouring down the roof to cool down the ambient, and it was one of the favorite places of the Sultan to spend time during summer. So I was just thinking, if we know something more about those buildings built in such fragile materials.
Two things come to mind there. The first is a glass pavilion built in the middle of a lake, Lake Beishahir, by Alauddin Keykubat in the early 13th century. And all we know of that is that it was built of zujaj. One wonders how thick it was, whether we're looking at crown glass or at something much, much thinner. Needless to say, it hasn't survived. Like many of the upper class, he liked the sound of breaking glass.
Oliver, you had a comment? Yes.
And I've got a second one.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, just about glass. Glass is in fact an extremely tough material, very strong in compression, so that you can make columns of glass that will hold up considerable weights and not be a fragile material.
Or staircases.
Staircases, indeed. We could have propped up the whole gallery on glass. It was the fire regulations that stopped us. So, reference to the Victorian Art Museum Glass Gallery.
So thank you for that, because it brings me to a third example, which I did mention briefly. The Royal Majlis in Madinat al-Zahra had pillars of transparent material. Who knows what that transparent material was? More likely to be glass than rock crystal, but no one knows. And one has to remember in that case, in the 10th century case, that this was the same majlis that had the pond of quicksilver and that had walls covered with gold plate, so that wherever you looked, there were reflections. And the third example I had in mind was in Toledo, and it's the palace of Yahya, of the Nunids in the 10th century. And that's really rather like the palace that your Venetian traveler mentions in Istanbul. And it was in a garden, and this prince spent virtually all his income on buildings, and his name went down in legend as a man who pauperized himself for luxurious building. In particular, he was known for a pavilion made of glass in which he sat on hot summer's days, and fountains outside it played water over its walls, so that water trickled down the transparent walls of his palace. And he himself sat cool and dry, cool as a cucumber, and dry in the middle of his palace. And here's the extra bit that has to do with light, surrounded by wax tapers, all of them alight. So, I mean, the man obviously had an ego the size of Mount Everest, but it would have looked pretty good.
Do we have some other questions here? Yes, Yasmin.
Hillebrand, sorry. In the end of your lecture, you mentioned about the decoration, the ornament that was used, different ceilings and in domes, and how that recalls the celestial skies. And you had a brief reference to a Mamluk one. I automatically thought how in mosque furniture, particularly mimbars in the Mamluk period, and to another extent, Quran stands, rahel, that were made for large monumental Qurans, that there is sometimes, similar decoration, geometric decoration. Do you think it's possible we could say that there's a transfer of ornament and that there's a transfer of meaning, that there is a kind of a celestial reference to this kind of decoration? I'm thinking of the Quran as described as a book that is derived from a celestial tablet, and also a mimbar perhaps as a metaphorical stairway to heaven. I don't know, but I put that to you.
I'd say that I don't want to trespass on what Abdullah Kahil is going to talk about tomorrow, but basically we're looking at an entire visual universe where if artificially you single out the mihrab and you forget what's next to it, or what's standing by it on a rihla, you miss the point. No one, to my knowledge, has yet worked systematically on the inscriptions of minbars, associating them with the inscriptions of the mihrab next to it. But there are several examples where the inscriptions are coterminous. They continue from the mihrab to the minbar. So very obviously those two things are seen together. They form a unity. And what more likely than that unity should encompass the displayed Quran that is part of the set furnishings produced by the patron for these buildings. I think one has to look macroscopically instead of microscopically at times, and this is an example.
I have a question for Professor Contadini. You showed a rock crystal and that form with sort of its facets. It was the second slide that you showed. And I wanted to ask if you, in your investigation of actual objects, have seen that the craftsman may have chosen to put the fracture lines in specific areas of the bowls or ewers that they were making, in the thicker areas at the top or at the bottom? Are you looking to see if the geometrical facets of the raw material are somehow used in the made object?
That's definitely must be the case. Now, a scientific investigation of the kind you are talking about, of matching the relief decoration with the fractured planes, hasn't been done. But although very unfortunate, the PTU being dropped and broken, actually it becomes an incredibly useful case study for that type of investigation that you're talking about. So I'm sort of hoping that we can investigate that more.
Well, that just just a comment to that is, in diamond cutting or in the jewelry world, the person who selects the raw jewel to decide how it's going to be cut and who it goes to, that's a very important role. So it's possible that the assessor, do you think, might have been playing that same role?
That is mentioned by Al-Biruni.
Yeah, and is why he gets paid the most amount of money?
Yes, probably. Thank you very much.
There was another question down here.
Hello, thank you all for your wonderful talks. It was very enlightening. Being an architect, I'm very much interested in this idea of this unfolding narrative of space. And Professor Hillenbrand, you started this concept, and later Renata went on to explore it. It's quite a difficult idea to grasp, because how far does one go into reading this unfolding narrative? And the project that Renata shows, I know, having worked on it, it's very interesting, because trying to tweak one factor, you're faced with many other factors and many other variables. And then you're constantly asking yourself, how much further am I going back into the time which I'm trying to understand about, to understand the question. So what I guess I'm trying to say is, how far can we read into this unfolding narrative, and perhaps, possibly, the work of Ibn Haytham was mentioned. What if this could be another step to combine these readings, although I don't think he had any relationship to architecture whatsoever, but could this be perhaps another step to go back to the unfolding narrative of architecture and open the building to further exploration?
Well, believe me, I've asked myself that question several times, and I think that is, in terms of the way in which I at least look at the study of vision is to understand its biological basis, but then also to understand that vision is also culturally inflected. And to that point, I would say, so in the example of the Mosque of Cordoba, I hesitate to use any of Ibn al-Haytham because it's not the then and there. Now, but I would use the Euclidean geometrical explanations as they were current. So it would be interesting to actually get Elahi's opinion on this, simply because it's one thing to say you have a scientific affiliation. It's another to say, no, this is what was currently accepted. Now, if you take the actual space of Cordoba, and then you say, okay, at the time that Al-Hakam came to visit it, and we have such a date, right? And so this is where I measured it. And he looked at what was there. And the decision by himself and his architects, first of all, to continue it, replicate exactly what was there, to add another whole zone, which I did not deal with, I think is really interesting and important, and also to understand that whatever was built in that edition is connected with what is there already. And to me, it was absolutely overwhelming when I began to truly understand this. So cultural moment formation of vision at any one time, I think is something that we should actually stop and think about, and not just universally say, well, this is this and this is something else and this is, yes, I suppose at the biological basis it is, but it could be that it's worth actually annotating the particular instances. That's all that I would say right now, rather than anything equals anything else. I'm no longer satisfied with these kinds of explanations. I would at least like to pinpoint some moments during which we can be somewhat more reflective of what was the then and there. And I think I'll stop there, and I think maybe Elahi has something to say about that.
I will just add a couple of sentences to that. I mean, I agree with you, and I would even go further than saying even Euclid and the earlier works. We don't really know if these were available or even used, but any of them by people who are associated with the crafts and architecture and so on. I mean, we have the very interesting case of Abul Wafa Bozjani, who was the contemporary of Ibn Haytham. He's a little earlier, but his work is sometimes considered practical geometry because of the mathematical patterns that he talked about, that they match some of the things we actually have today. But it's very tricky to come and say, oh, these theoreticians and practitioners were in communication. I mean, there are these, bits and pieces of indications that maybe there were meetings and so on and so forth, but we can't really draw the line. And that's the reality of it. Even the Euclidean material that I know very well, I can never assume that people in the practical world actually used the texts. I mean, there is oral tradition, of course, and so on and so forth, but I agree with you on that.
But the building still stands up. And so if we reverse engineer it, okay, this is where it becomes quite interesting. That is, the building itself has to be approached as a product of a knowledge system. And to the extent that we can reverse engineer it, we should be able to actually come up with at least modes of behavior in terms of structural behavior.
Oh,
So,
absolutely,
yeah, that's basically
they
it.
match and
Yeah.
so on.
So therefore, close enough, okay, but not quite like this, okay. And so there you go. I don't know.
But in Europe, people used Euclid's optics, and people associate that with perspective. This one proposition in it. So it's as knowledge systems, they work together. But whether or not we can say, well, they must have been related. That's a different story. That's my solution.
I was going to take chairman's prerogative again and address the question to Bill Graham by pointing out, first of all, that some of you who don't read Arabic may not know that this is the light verse written, that God is the light of the heavens and the earth, is what is written there by Mohammed Zakaria and on all of your bags and on all of our literature and the signs, so you can proudly walk around and show that. And he actually adopted or adapted his usual teardrop to make it a circle because he thought that that was a more suitable visual form. But for Bill, I was struck when you said there were 63 occurrences of words. 69, okay. Probably, but could you compare that to other things? Is light then a central theme, or is light, peripheral, and you've just been digging every little detail out?
Well, I did try to dig every detail out, but no, I think light is one of the more permeating themes. If you look at the Quran, it's not that it's the most common thing. I'm sure there are words that occur, 300, and not just Allah. I mean, there are words that occur 300 and 400.
What about compared to Kitab, for instance?
Kitab, I'm not sure how many, but Kitab is well over 100 in any case.
All right, so we're in
So, but I think that, you know, with Nur at 43, that still is a very common, that makes it a pretty
Yeah,
common
we have a
word.
ranking here, like basketball, basketball.
But if you look at a concordance, you'll see there are words that take up many pages. So most of all, a lot, but I mean, but there are others. So no, I wouldn't say that it's a predominant theme, but I think it's a very consistent theme. And you find it as what's interesting is you find it both in early surahs, according to certainly to the traditional calculation and according to most of the modern scholarly calculations, you find it in different phases of the Quranic revelation. So whether Meccan or Medinan, both will contain passages with containing words dealing with light, and certainly Nur itself. But all these other words are there too.
I was going to ask a question.
Yes.
Well, I just want to make one thing as we close, I think, which is, as people were talking, I was reminded, my great-grandfather, who was born in 1860 in what is now Poland and Russia, wrote his autobiography in the teens or 20s, and he describes a moment in his childhood where he found a broken kerosene lamp and he was able to buy the replacement pieces. And he said for the first time they had steady light at night. And that image has always struck me, because I think that as we're surrounded by this let there be light and we turn on the lights, or that we don't really see how precious and expensive this was, that as Renata was lighting the Mosque of Cordova, or I remember as people were talking that we know that from Cordova that the road to Medina de Zahra was lit at night. It must have been this extraordinary expression of power over the natural universe. So I think we should...
So as powerful one?
It's powerful one. I want to thank you all, thank our speakers for their wonderful performances today. I want to thank the audience for their wonderful questions. Keep your questions for tomorrow. We'll have more time afterwards, and there will be a reception tomorrow afternoon after the session, and we regather here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So thank you very much. Thank our